Poems to a Listener, readings and conversation with contemporary poets.
Roadside Marker. A light morning snow as dusted each letter, altering the text. Now the frontier militia cannot find its way through the great swamp. The Indians break camp and fade into the trees. There is no dim clearing littered with the bodies of horses and dying men. No roadway ahead of you scattered with beer cans and broken glass. Before you can stop and get out to touch your fingers to these words, the sun will have turned the page. The tale will be gilded again.
Welcome. I'm Henry Lyman, and that was poet Jared Carter, author of After the Rain, published by Cleveland State University Poetry Center. The poem we just heard brings us to an historical marker on a littered roadside somewhere in Indiana. A light snow has covered the text, commemorating something purported to have happened there. Some battle, perhaps, between soldiers and Indians.
Well, these markers are put up by the state or the county, and they're big chunks of bronze, usually, sometimes aluminum, and it'll have a text there, and the letters themselves will be highlighted in gold paint against a dark background, so that it's a little gilded tale of history put up by the local historical society. But that it's gilded means this is the very, very official version of what we like to believe really happened here. Then the snow comes along just momentarily and changes that.
It shows us the unofficial version.
Yeah, that we glimpse for just a second, the same way we see the road up ahead is momentarily pure and white and clear and has no blemishes and no beer cans. But it just lasts for a second, and then when the sun melts the snow off the letters, we're back to the gilded version again, the public, official version.
But for the moment there was that brief vision of what might have happened.
The veil is drawn aside. Yeah. Small towns, a few houses and a general store. The map might show only one road going through, but if you keep driving around long enough, you begin to understand how they're connected. There are back roads running in all directions. You just have to get out and look for them. People living out there have known each other for a long time. They still have family reunions in late August with tables under the trees. Places with names like Hadley and Springtown and Coatesville. Most of them manage to keep a grain elevator going, maybe a post office. I'm a real estate appraiser. These days I spend a lot of time out looking at farms. I've got a bunch of good maps in my car, old ones too. You don't want to go back to town and admit you couldn't even find the place you were looking for, or got lost. One day last September, I was driving along a gravel road between Clayton and Hadley, using an old county map. Up ahead was a little town called Summit that had been a flag stop once, on a spur slanting off from the main line to Terre Haute. That spur's been gone for years. Summit was gone too, but I found it after a while, figured out exactly where it had been, right at the top of a long rise you could see stretching for miles across the countryside. Nothing out there now but lots of beans and corn, blue sky and clouds. Not even fence rows anymore. You could almost imagine the train heading west up that long grade, pouring on the coal, making for high ground. When it finally pulled in, the telegraph man would come out for the mail, and there would be a couple of small boys sitting on the baggage wagon, waving to the engineer. I walked up to the only place it could have been, right there, at the crest of the hill. Somebody had kept it mowed. There was a strong wind blowing. I searched around in the grass for a long time, but I couldn't find anything. Not a trace. Only the land itself, and the way it still rose up.
There's something about the land, the way it just rises up there.
I think he's been in that world long enough to understand that there are invisible fields of force that settle or exist out in this otherwise empty landscape that still make it human and still make it worth caring about. But it's empty, or it appears to be empty. But in fact, it isn't. There are perhaps ghosts there. They're the ghosts of the train, the telegraph man, and the two little boys. Right. And it's not empty at all. It has these presences who rise up gradually as he starts around. He works to call them. He searches through the grass, and he's looking for something, and it is granted for a short time a sense that it's all still there.
Yeah. He does see them for a moment in his mind's eye,
and realizes that all those lines of force have come together there. While you were out driving around looking for a place like Summit, you might come to some little town, and right on the main street would be a sign that would say, Portrait Studio. And that's the sort of place that you'd bring your children and maybe to have a graduation picture taken. And chances are you were probably taken there yourself when you were a child. And even your father or your grandfather might have gone up the same stairway and been shot with the same camera in the same kind of old dark room where people had been in the business of making photos, maybe even since the Civil War. Still here, then, the antique letters in gold, the sun-bleached faces peering through the glass, all of them still waiting. The old backdrops have stayed the same, the hand-painted curtains. You do not have to look twice to see them standing before those frozen waterfalls, those eternally snow-capped mountains, none of which ever existed in these parts. Instead, you climb the staircase wedged between the dime store and the drug store. You go up into the hallway, the gray corridor. You find the right words on the frosted pane. Step in, and the photographer appears, drying his hands on his apron, just popped out of the dark room. No helper today. In the studio, everything is piled and dim and dusty. It was his father's before he took it over. The windows are boarded up with what used to be called car siding, varnished once but peeling now. You spin the wooden stool and sit down, while he moves the spotlights and reflectors, while he fusses with the camera angle, while he asks about your daughter. Your eyes begin to see shapes beyond the brightness, and you sense that in the finished portrait, he will show you gazing out of shadows your father knew, even your grandfather. There will be a patch of light hovering in the background, just above your shoulders. And beyond that, toward the edge, a darkness. Part of what appears there will be painted, part will be reflection, and part will be something into which you have been growing all this time, as though an old cloak, made up of many folds and gathers, still being held out for you, almost fitted you now.
There's that cloak at the end.
Well, I had been looking at a number of old photographs in my family and just the old photographs from the earlier times, and they always have a strange background. Part of it is painted, part of it is the way the lights were set up, part of it is maybe something the photographer introduces, and I just became fascinated with the texture and the quality of that light. And by the end of the poem, it becomes a cloak that wraps around the speaker. It's his final encounter with something that's waiting there for him all these years.
Mm-hmm.
It's his destiny, his fate. It doesn't quite fit, I don't think. It fits better now than it did maybe when he was 10 years old and sat there with his whole family for the Easter portrait, or when he was 17 and he was graduating from high school. Maybe it was barely visible then, but it's getting darker and it's more enveloping.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like a cloak. It has many folds and gathers, and there's ample room for it.
Mm-hmm.
And there was room for his grandfather and room for his father, and there'll be room for him. It's the history of their community, the invisible world that binds them all together.
There's a poem of yours that doesn't have to do with photography, but rather painting. It's a view of Indianapolis,
yes,
as it used to be.
It's a view of Indianapolis in about 1865 or thereabouts. And actually, it's a chromolithograph. It's an old colored print that I saw in a museum somewhere. What a strangely beautiful city this might have been, even now, had someone enforced the ruling about no buildings being taller than the monument. There is a view of the mile square taken back before the Civil War, looking south from the top of the Asylum for the Blind. It shows where everything used to be. Remember, this is an artist's rendition. Photography had not yet reached these parts. Still, you can look out and see the zinc dome of the old State House that fell in back in '82, compelling all the citizens to pony up for the present structure. You can see elm trees riffling in the wind, and steeples thrusting up everywhere, and gardens where people are growing things in their backyards. It is the sort of place Wordsworth saw from a bridge one morning. It is what Leonardo saw when he looked out from Fiesole, the city, again, with all its torches burning. They will tell you now that we no longer see what Wordsworth saw, or Burns, or even Riley. They will tell you that not even Lorca or Yeats or Neruda could imagine all the reasons why we have to do things the way we do now. They will pause and look out from paneled rooms high above the streets, where no air from the outside gets in, where rain streaking the windows is laced with acid, and the only view is down.
The poem lets us see through the city as it is now to what it must have looked like, what it might be if it hadn't changed.
I almost think the poet or the speaker and the man who made the original chromolithograph are saying, yes, this vision is still possible if you hold it before you, if you care about it enough. If you can call up a vision of a city that was the equal of the one that Wordsworth saw looking out from Westminster Bridge, or cities that have been shown in great paintings. Mm-hmm. And this can still happen. I think he's saying it doesn't matter if at the moment there are impersonal stone cubes and people in them who are somewhat indifferent to history or to the past. It's still possible. We can still summon a vision and be moved by it.
But the people who are referred to at the end of the poem, in their offices high above the streets, think quite differently.
Well, there's just a tragic lot. They're so high up, the only view they have is down. It's not out.
Yeah.
It's only down in several senses of the word. Of course, there are other levels to that city. while they're looking out that particular window, there may be someone 10 blocks away coming up the street, coming up the alley, past the parking lot, getting a completely different view of this same town, seeing vastly different things at the street level. Queen Anne's lace. That they think of you as a weed, that no one stops by the roadside or in the alleyways of the inner city, where nothing remains of what once was except the paving bricks and the limestone curb, and a long, perfect phalanx of your blossoms, taller than a man. That they cannot see you, have no time to look, do not know your leaves, have lived with you all their lives and failed to recognize your name, have never watched the drift of your galaxies, your pale green blossoms flattening into white on their long stalks, your brightness unfolding. That they are obsessed with things known not with the heart, but the mind, that will last no longer than their grasping. That they cut down forests and cover the earth with pitch. That they string together empty phrases, that nothing matters except that which can be measured or given a number. That they do not know your secrets or what is yielded in your harvest, how you have nothing and yet are shared among those who have nothing, how a drop of flame burns at your heart, how being everywhere and unseen, you are nowhere and thus free to come and go, invisible and lasting. How I grew up playing in places where you abounded, and was never told what to call you, saw no reason why either of us should ever wax or wane. How I learned your name from grandmothers, and even now grow forgetful of what others wanted me to know, and come back to what I first remember, which is why I pause to see you standing in the sunlight, why I stop near the trestle bridge at noon and cross the empty lot, to enter an abandoned field of your blossoms waving in the wind, to come close in that stillness and walk among you again in your shadowless beauty. I used to walk to work in this neighborhood in downtown Indianapolis, and there was this big row of Queen Anne's lace, taller than me. They were like triffids standing there. And they're the bunch that got me started writing this, because it seemed like they were there every day watching me walk along the alley. And I remembered all the other patches of Queen Anne's lace I had ever played with and been around. And it's just everywhere. In the Midwest, people consider it a weed.
It has nothing, as you say, it has nothing, yet it is shared by those who have nothing.
Well, I think the people who notice the plants are those who aren't really concerned with who owns what, or lines of property or demarcation of this or that. They're concerned with life and with the joy of seeing living things. And so if you own nothing, you have nothing, then these plants are yours, even if they're on someone else's property. You have a relationship with them. Once a man I know who deals in pianos and who takes anything as a trade-in took me to a bricked-up building on a side street on a day approaching 100 degrees, and with a coat-hanger key let me inside a shuttered room filled with hundreds of pianos, so crowded together there was no space to walk between them, all uprights, all worthless, all damaged or forgotten, and beyond repair, beyond redemption. 4 cast-iron pillars, stamped with ivy, reached up to the corners of a skylight boarded over with plywood. The tops of the pianos were thick with soot and bits of fallen plaster. All I could do was climb up and walk around on top of them. The dealer stood in the alley and smoked a cigarette while I stepped from one dusty lid to another, up higher than I should have been, going nowhere in particular, occasionally hearing beneath my feet an echo, a hollow stirring, as though some mechanism, some tension still surviving, had registered my passing. Now and then I stopped to kneel, to lean all the way over to an open keyboard, halfway expecting to see my own reflection there. Finally, reached down to touch a middle C, held it for a moment, listened to that single note rise up ringing through the darkened room. I'm an amateur pianist myself, and I think everybody who plays, you can remember every piano you ever had. And they're more real to you than your pets. And it's a terrible time when you give one up, even if you're getting a new one. To say goodbye to the old one is a tragic moment. And here's where they go. This is the elephant's graveyard of old pianos.
And there's a suggestion that something of their past lives on in each of them. There's that hollow stirring, that tension that you feel as you're walking across the tops of the piano.
This is in part metaphorical, as they're anthropomorphized here, but at the same time, half of these are old player pianos. See, they're full of hardware inside. It's just wound up in strange ways when they got thrown on the scrap heap. And there would be levers and gears and springs and coils and things that would still have some kinetic energy that would be stored there, which is released as he walks about. And he's hearing this. It's as though a low muttering of souls in this underworld here, that they're aware of his presence and maybe faintly calling to him, as beckoning. And he can't get down to their level. They're too far. They're too far down.
He does bend over.
He does bend over at one point.
And sees his reflection in the keyboard, almost like a face, like the face of the piano appearing there for a moment.
A pool of something, of tranquility that he disturbs, and by reaching through it, almost through the mists of time and touching the key.
Yeah.
He doesn't play a chord. He just touches that C and holds it down so it will linger, and it fills the room and vibrates. There is a grace in the way people do things, even the simplest tasks. The dance with which their fingers encircle the chicken's gaze, coaxing the edges of its eyes into paleness. They're calling upon it to rest now. They're speaking in a way that acknowledges something common to both of them, reassuring it like a mother, smoothing down the ruffled neck feathers, lightly stroking with their fingertips the comb's red membrane, knowing, as they touch, that it is like other erect, familiar flesh, yet continuing to speak softly, as though enchanted by their own syllables, patiently explaining, while leaning closer to the top of the upturned log, the bitten rings in the wood, the axe handle carefully positioned, comforting it, promising that everything is going to be all right, whispering to it, as though it loved sentences, as though it knew words. For in this way we ward off thoughts of bedtime stories that end in darkness, of lullabies heard so long ago. Nothing remains now, only their silence. Least of all, do we allow ourselves a glimpse of that image seconds away, the chicken's body searching through the grass, but unable to remember why. And this not knowing is a part of the grace of doing what must be done, even the most difficult task. Not to remember what it was like before, not to expect forgiveness after, not to want more than what you have at this moment, which is a live creature looming like a bell in your hands, and your own voice hushed to cry out at the inevitable ringing. I used to see this when I was a little boy, and next door, the neighbors would always be slaughtering a chicken now and then, killing a chicken, and I was terrified. They would set it out on the grass, and half the time it'll run, 10 or 15 feet. That's an image I never forgot.
The person doing the slaughtering seems almost to be preparing his own death as well. The poem seems to be leading towards an acknowledgement of the communality between the chicken and the killer of the chicken.
Yes, today the chicken, tomorrow the speaker. It's all inevitable, and the same kinds of rituals will attend the passing of each, and the calming effect, and the voices muffled and then crying out. I suppose in doing in the chicken, he looks forward to his own inevitable rites that are coming.
Well, his cry at the end, a hushed cry, anticipates the sound that the creature is going to make.
Yeah, he's hushed because he's adopting a reverential attitude towards this, which is what we're advised to do. Approach this humbly. This is a living creature. It is not another object. It breathes and has feeling as you do, and it's not something to be undertaken lightly. It's to be taken with ritual and a sense of humility. Each evening I would go for a walk by myself, down to the West Branch, to look at the current, to see how high or low it might be running. Living out there, you try to guess the weather for the next few days by watching the sunsets, studying the clouds. Sometimes you can tell what's to come by what the deer have eaten, or which birds have started south. New ones come down from the north, too. I had stepped off the trail to look at a line of prints and sensed something near, perhaps 10 paces. There was still enough light. A snowy owl, moon-faced and pale, waited in shadow, aware of my presence, having no reason to go. We both waited. We both watched each other. When the time was right, it leaned and fell headlong from its perch, letting gravity seize and draw it down as though a sack of sand had been cut loose, and halfway through the dive began to flatten out and start to turn, forcing the earth's pull forward, shifting all that power into wings which, unfurled and shaken once, twice, carried it cleanly across the glade and out along the trees below the ridge. Nothing else had moved or made a sound. I walked on down till I could hear water. The creek was up, but the night seemed cold.
Poet Jared Carter, author of After the Rain, published by Cleveland State University Poetry Center. I'm Henry Lyman. Thanks for joining us.
Poems to a Listener was produced by Henry Lyman in cooperation with WFCR, Amherst, Massachusetts. This program was supported by the Witter Binner Foundation for Poetry and the National Endowment for the Arts.